Very early on in my as a young boy, I always wanted to fly airplanes, and in 1958, when I first went to college at the University of Connecticut, they had Air Force ROTC, so I signed up for that, and they told me I couldn't fly airplanes, that I had some physical disability with an astigmatism in my eyes. So I waited until I graduated, and in 1962, when I graduated, the draft was still around, and we were expected to serve. So I joined the Navy, and they, through a program, would let me fly. So that was very much the reason I signed up, was because I wanted to fly airplanes, and I was performing my duty and my service to the country by signing up in the Navy, and I chose the Navy at 4 years or 5 years, rather than the being drafted and not doing what somebody else wanted to do. I was going to do what I wanted to do. The recruiter, when I signed up, and I said, there are a lot of airplanes in the Navy. How do I get to fly the planes that I want to fly? And he said, it's not very easy, but it's very simple. He said, come out at the top of your class, and you get any assignment that the detailer has available. So I worked and came out number 2 in my class at Pensacola in basic and advanced first advanced flight training, and got assigned to fighters because that's what I wanted to fly, which was at that point in time, the F-4B Phantom, a Mach 2 interceptor with a new concept, and I was very happy with that. Went on to more training in Miramar in California, which is just north of San Diego, and went on to the fleet got to the fleet actually in late November 1963. And I was in Sasebo, Japan, waiting for the carrier to come in when John F. Kennedy was shot. And I went into I was palling around with another ensign that had come out of Newport and was going to one of the destroyers in the same task force. And so we checked in at 8 o'clock every morning, and I heard when I checked in that the president had been shot. So stopped by the Officers Club bar area on the way out, and up over the bar there was a very, very large, for the time, 20-inch black and white television. And they had just started with satellite transmission. So it had live coverage of the incidents in Dallas, and watched that. And in the back of the room, there was a very senior lieutenant with salt and pepper gray hair. I could tell he had many service ribbons and all. And he was what we called in the Navy a Mustang. He'd been an enlisted man, done very well, and became an officer, and was now as a lieutenant. And I noticed that he had wings, and so he was a flyer. But he was playing the slot machines at 9:30 in the morning, and obviously had a whiskey sour beside him, obviously a little bit tipsy. And nobody at the bar wanted to question him because the bartender was an enlisted man on off duty and serving there. And the other people, except there was one woman at the bar, and I don't remember who she was or whatever, but she finally turned around and said, would you knock that off for a while? We're trying to listen to this coverage. And he slurred, I will not. And he kept chinging away on the slot machines. And the other ensign and I, after watching it for a while, went out into town and went around, looked at some things, hired a taxi, and just drove around town. And never thought much more about it until I got to the carrier. And I was in the ready room being introduced to all the people I'd be flying with. And all of a sudden, Ray Rigmaiden was introduced to me, and I said, that's the same person that was in the bar. And he was in our squadron, flew on a regular basis, except we had to leave him off the flight schedule for the first 3 days or so out of port until he dried out from drinking all the time when he was in port. And I remember seeing him in the wardroom one day with half a cup of black coffee in his hand. And he was shaking so badly that he couldn't get it to his lips without spilling coffee on the table. Now, he went through the rest of the cruise. Every time he went into port, he went in and got absolutely drunk and somehow made it back every time. But for some reason, nobody did anything about it other than just keep him off the flight schedule for 3 days until he came back, and then he transferred somewhere else, and I'm sure somebody got to him because he couldn't live long being that way. But I lost track of him. But that was my first experience. Wasn't my first experience with alcoholism, but because I'd grown up in a town that had an alcoholic. But
starting out with flight training, tell me a little bit about that experience. I mean, it's one thing to take off and land on, runway, but carrier takeoff and take me through a little bit of the rigors of what you experienced.
It's a very exacting experience because you have to put the plane down in a place on the flight deck that's moving, and it's moving at about 30 knots and with the wind across the deck. And you have to put it down in a spot that's about 20 feet wide and 120 feet long with the plane that's going 135 miles an hour. So it's a very exacting experience, and the two things that are very, very different about Navy flying is takeoff, which is a catapult shot, what we call the cat shot, where in a little less than 3 seconds, you go from standing still to 140, 150 miles an hour. And it's in a space of about 300 feet. And when you get to the end, you're looking down at green water and angry waves. And the nice thing is you're almost flying at that point. And the other, of course, is landing, which you go in again in a little less than 3 seconds, go from 135 knots, 150 miles an hour to a full stop and on the flight deck with a wire.
So the training, on-ground training, tell me a little bit about how that takes place. How do you simulate what you're really going to experience on the flight deck, and then when you're on the flight deck, are you back seat for some experience, and then get into the front seat? As I recall, F4 is
right, is a two-seat, and I flew in the back. And on land, we at Miramar had a simulated with lights flight deck on the second runway, and day and night we would practice that. Go in and do touch and goes, and practice that, and go around and around and around. Sometimes until 2 o'clock in the morning, because of the number of people that had to simulate carrier landings, and you did that until then. We would go out for what we called carrier quals or carrier qualifications, and you had to make 5 carrier landings, successful carrier landings, and that was to go to sea. You had to pass through carrier qualifications and do that. So.
And which carrier was your first assignment?
Primarily the Kitty Hawk. I flew off, which is now scrap metal. It was the last of the oil-fired aircraft carriers. They are all nuclear since then, and the big difference is that we couldn't go more than a few weeks at a time without refueling, where now you can go nine months or more and not have to refuel. So it's a big difference, a big change in the whole carrier propulsion. And the first cruise, which was the 1963-64 cruise, we were in the Western Pacific in the central station. There are 3 stations, one up in northern Japan, which can get extremely cold because you're up near Vladivostok, Russia, and all in the Siberia. And the central station we were on, and the southern station was down closer to the Tonkin Gulf. Now, right at the end of the first cruise, toward the middle of 1964, we steamed at 32 knots from the middle station up in the middle of Japan down to the southern station to be in the Tonkin Gulf. And that was before things really heated up. And we flew there, and we flew in over Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, in addition to South Vietnam. Our logbooks were scrubbed, it's just white out. I went in, and if there was any reference to any landings or flying over Laos, Cambodia, or Thailand, they would write it out, and it was gone. So, because we were only supposed to be there as advisors. We weren't supposed to be actually doing things. So.
Were some of these training missions nighttime, daylight?
They were both night and day. We have to be a lot more careful at night. You don't run into a mountain or something, but it was both day and night. On the second cruise, we spent most of the time in the Tonkin Gulf, or shuttling between the Tonkin Gulf and Cubi Point in the Philippines, which is just north of Manila. There's an air base there, plus a naval base, and a place that they could repair the ship, and if it was needed repairs, and they could load ammunition, because we ran out. The supply chain wasn't very good, and we ran out of the newer bombs that had been made and were more stable. So we were using, at some point in time, World War II bombs that had been cooking in a warehouse for 50 years and were quite volatile. As a matter of fact, the bad fire that they had on the Constellation was a result of bombs cooking off and exploding on the flight deck, and punching a hole in the flight deck and going down. So they didn't want to transfer those bombs in at an at-sea underway replenishment, which they could do with oil or food stores or anything else parts. They didn't want to transfer those kind of bombs because they were volatile and bouncing around, going from a supply ship being brought on board the carrier. They were afraid they might go off, so we would go into Cubi Point and load up the ammunition on the ammunition magazines. So.
Talk to me a little bit about that period of time, and with all that experience, what you learned from that as an individual. Did you learn things about yourself in terms of reaction, emotions, interactions with your fellow pilots and crew members? Tell me about that, what that new experience did for you or to you.
It's a whole maturation process, and you mature very quickly. On the way into the Tonkin Gulf, the each squadron had a flight surgeon who, of course, once we were on board a carrier, doubled and helped out with the 5,000 or 5,500 people on the ship with sick bay and so forth. But they were assigned to the flight squadrons. And remember the flight surgeon? His name was Ben Bowen. I called him Doc Bowen. And he came in and he said, "I'd like to tell you a little bit about a couple of things you have in your survival pack. One is actually two syringes of jellied morphine." And he said, "There's enough morphine in there that if you're really lucky, you might be able to walk out on a broken leg." He said, "But if you use what's in those two syringes of morphine, we'll be sending, and you do get out, we'll be sending you home with a habit." And that gave me a very, very healthy respect for the addictive qualities of opioids. And I have forever been very, very careful in whatever I've done if I've ever needed painkillers, to be very careful with opioids and make sure that it's very short term and only used when it's absolutely necessary. The other thing we had that he explained to us was a little off-white pill, about the size and shape of a baby aspirin, that we would normally carry in a pocket that we could get to with either hand in case we broke an arm on the way out. But it was cyanide, and so it was a suicide pill. And he said, if you ever decide that you do not want to be captured and taken prisoner of war, he said, just slip it under your tongue or swallow it, and in 30 seconds to a minute, you'll never know anything again. Now, I thought very long and hard about that. I was 25 years old at the time. And I decided, because of my faith, that suicide was wrong, and I wouldn't take it. Now, after having been given the benefit of a little 20/20 hindsight, and having had the opportunity to talk to a friend and squadron mate of mine named Charlie Plum, who got a plane shot out from under him when he was over Hanoi and spent the next 6 years of his life being tortured in North Vietnamese prison camps. And reading some of the stories of some of the others who were shot down and were never got to a prison camp, were taken, somebody would tie a rope around their ankles, drag them through the streets, and be stoned to death. I changed my mind, and I think that I decided later that I made the wrong initial decision, and that I probably would take that pill if I was, rather than being captured. That's not a very good thing to have happen. But I remember one alpha strike in particular. Now, alpha strikes were the large strikes that you had 32 to 40 planes, and you went in. And I remember one going in on a power plant between Hanoi and Haiphong. It was at Ong Bi, Ongbi. It's actually Ongbi is how it was spelled. We went in on that with 32 planes, and we put 32 planes on and off the target in just about a minute. So there's one crossing at the bottom every 2 seconds. We destroyed. There was two. It was a power plant with 2 smokestacks. We destroyed both. Both smokestacks were down when we got. We had done significant damage to the buildings, but hadn't completely destroyed the equipment inside. So about somewhere in the following week after that, the 2 A6s went in one night and finished it off, and that place today, that spot today is a park. They never rebuilt a power plant on it. The Russians built the North Vietnamese a nuclear-powered power plant about a mile and a half, 2 miles down the road, but the place where that power plant was is now a park. But what I discovered in 1980, that's after Saigon fell in 1975, 1980, a Canadian journalist named Peter Arnett did a documentary, and it was called The 1,000-Day War. And it was on NBC, and as part of it, he had an interview with Dean Rusk, who had been Secretary of State at the time. And it's very well known that Lyndon Johnson micromanaged the war. And he chose every single major target. And it was at a weekly meeting on Tuesday at lunchtime in the White House. And the meeting consisted of Johnson and his Chief of Staff, Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time, and representatives of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they chose the targets that would be struck, major targets that would be struck between the next day, Wednesday, and the following Tuesday. And the disturbing thing that Dean Rusk admitted during this interview was that Robert McNamara would walk out of that meeting with the target list in his hand and hand it to Dean Rusk, who would pass it through the Swiss embassy to the North Vietnamese. So they knew we were coming every single time. Now, their rationale was that by giving them advance notice, it would allow the North Vietnamese to move women and children and civilians away from targets, which they never did. They just moved their heavy anti-aircraft around. So the anti-aircraft fire that I remember seeing on that day, looking down in the middle of the bombing run, looked like a red translucent carpet or a dome over the anti-aircraft fire. Was so heavy. And it was set so that they had guessed at what our bombing run would look like, and that we would go through it on the way down and back through it on the way back up. But fortunately, I guess for us, we briefed on a much steeper dive angle, which can be much more accurate, but you also start out higher, pull out higher to avoid hitting any bomb fragments as they go off. And I remember all the planes in the section that I was in. I flew with the youngest pilot in the squadron, front seat pilot in the squadron. So we always flew on somebody else's wing. But the section we flew in, and I was on the wing. We were on the wing of the section leader. We all carried. Each plane had two 2,000-pound, excuse me, high fragmentation bombs that with 36-inch daisy cutters, fuses on the front. Now, daisy cutter fuse is 36 inches long, sticks out in front of the bomb, and goes off and makes the bomb go off above ground and just spreads shrapnel all over, and it's meant for flak suppression. And so we were go in first to try and knock down the anti-aircraft fire so the rest of the planes could have a more orderly bombing run. So I was in the back seat. I had control of the radar and the weapons system. And so sometimes the plane was designed in the late 50s as an interceptor, but it was designed with a whole new concept that would use missiles rather than guns to intercept a hostile plane. And thing is, we never used it that way, but it was designed to. You were designed to be able to detect a target at 25 miles, to be able to shoot at target, at 4 to 5 miles distant without ever seeing it. Now, of course, the politicians came in and established what they called the rules of engagement, which meant you had to have a positive ID, and in most cases, you had to prove that you were shot at first before you could fire on a. So it meant that we lost all the advantages that the plane was designed for, and had to do a whole new technique. And that's why they designed and developed the fighter weapons school, which was known as Top Gun. I came back from Vietnam in 1966 wearing my aviator sunglasses, having no idea how cool I was supposed to look until years later, when the first Top Gun movie came out, and I saw Tom Cruise and Val Kilmer strutting around with theirs. And
Talk to me a little bit about your transition after Navy service to your first work experiences.
I got out of the Navy and decided to try and find a job, and finally decided on banking, and went to work for the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York to become a commercial lending officer. Now, as I said, I came back in 1966. In 1966, the New York Times referred to Vietnam veterans as baby killers. So we were known as baby killers. I learned very quickly to not mention the fact that I had been, that I was a veteran, or particularly the fact that I'd been in Vietnam. So that was so I went through that and became a commercial lending officer at Chase, and then later on did something became an assistant treasurer at American Express. That's another story.
To continue maybe a little bit of the story, again, some of the discipline, the reaction to certain events, I'm sure that what you experienced during wartime had some influence on how you addressed or encountered or dealt with, the civilian, executive workforce. Any story that you can share about how your experience was an advantage to you in your career, civilian?
In the military, you learn very quickly to be responsible, and carry that responsibility and deal with a lot of situations.
Have you had, over these decades now, interactions with veterans, either at events or whatever? And are there any stories that you hear from other veterans about their experience that you can then, that you relate to, or that you commiserate with, or has there been any type of situations like that you've participated in?
Well, the squadron that I was in, particularly on the 1965-66 cruise, still gets together on a regular basis. We started out in the early 2000s. We would go to the infamous Tailhook Convention in Reno. The Tailhook, which is an association of Navy, basically fighter pilots, got kicked out of Las Vegas for their sins in 1991 because they did some very bad things. And if you can do something, if you can get thrown out of Sin City for your sins, you've done something. So we met in Reno, but now it's a bunch of old guys standing around telling each other war stories. But we started out there, and then we've met various places around the country, and most recently we've gone to Zoom because so many of us just don't travel anymore. We're all in our 80s and 90s if we're alive. And so, but that includes Charlie Plum, who was the one that I knew that spent
Wow.
6 years of his life being tortured.
Did you have interactions with Air Force personnel during that deployment time? Tell me a little bit about if and where and how that happened.
We did one exercise with Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is known for their missiles and missile protection, and where we took four planes. We all suited up in pressure suits, which are almost like a space suit, not quite as sophisticated, but the same general idea. It provides a high altitude environment, lets you fly in a high altitude environment. And we went up to Vandenberg Air Force Base and flew off the coast to the missile range out off the other side of Catalina Island in the Pacific. And the four of us did a high altitude called a pop-up or high altitude maneuver, where we got at about 50,000 feet, got up to a little over Mach 2, pulled the nose back and aimed for 80,000 feet. The idea was they wanted to see if the Sparrow air-to-air missile could shoot down an incoming ICBM. So we did that. The particular plane that I was on got to 78,000 feet, didn't quite make the 80,000. But up at 80,000 feet, or 78,000 feet, it's pitch black in the middle of the day. Stars are out. You look out at the horizon and you can clearly see the curvature of the Earth, and you can see the clouds that are some almost 60,000 feet below you, with the sun shining off the top. The four planes that day fired 5 Sparrow missiles. Not one of them hit the target. One came close, but the mission obviously whole mission was classified, so I never heard the results. But I think you would have heard about it if it had worked, and so my conclusion was that it didn't work. It was an interesting time to get up there, because at 80,000 feet the air is so thin that you're just kind of hanging there, trying to make sure the engine still runs, because there's so little air coming in. You're at about 200 knots indicated airspeed, which is just a little at that makeup. You're just a little bit over the stall speed, going close to Mach 2 up there, and so it was a. And you could wipe the inside of the cockpit with the stick to make that at lower altitudes would put you into very fast aileron turns, and it just barely made a turn to either way or the other. And so it was an interesting, fascinating.
Yeah. In your thinking about this particular conversation, are there some things that you would like to bring up about your experience, or that we haven't kind of gotten into a little bit? Anything from your notes?
Yeah, I remember one that was fairly early on. I walked into the ready room one day, and the executive officer of the squadron came to me and said, "Put on your flight suit. We're going to Alameda Air Force, our Navy base, which is it's a naval air station up in the San Francisco Bay Area." Apparently, one of our planes had been was down up there because it needed a part, and to get the part through the normal supply system was going to take 2 or 3 days, so they didn't want to let it sit vacant or idle for that time. So we were going to fly the part up there, and it was a small part, stick it in the cockpit and go. So we took off and went up and got to the area, and the Alameda was a little bit hazy and foggy, so it was instrument flight conditions on the way in, and they gave us an immediate landing time, put us in the pattern, and so we were too heavy. We had too much fuel, and the other thing that happened was the executive officer had been told that the microphone in his oxygen mask was bad and wasn't working, but he decided to go anyway without changing it out because he liked the oxygen mask that he had and he thought it was comfortable and didn't want it. So basically, we had no intercom communications between the cockpits. It was just hand signals and whatever. And they gave us an immediate, we had good radio, but his microphone was bad. They gave us an immediate landing time. And so we were too heavy, so I wasn't surprised when he did the maneuver he did, which was he found that a good way to dump a lot of fuel very quickly was to open the dump valve and put the plane into a very tight high G turn, 360-degree turn, and by the time we'd gone through 360 degrees, we'd dumped enough fuel. Now, what I didn't know, because we didn't have a repeater fuel gauge in the back, was that he forgot to turn off the dump valve. And we got on final approach, and he finally recognized it and turned the dump valve off. And everything was okay until the Alameda Tower pulled a, what we call a bug smasher, which is a C-45 Twin Beach, an older plane, prop plane, on the runway in front of us, very slow, and approved them for takeoff. So they said to us, just go around once. Well, we didn't have enough fuel to go around and have the 20% fuel required for an instrument landing. So I immediately gave him a vector for Edwards Air Force Base, which is right over the mountains, would have good weather, and we could land with a VFR landing and not worry about an instrument approach. So we climbed to altitude, and all of a sudden, through hand signals and all, he shut one engine down to save fuel, which didn't surprise me. Then within a minute later, he shut the second engine down because we still didn't have enough fuel to get to Edwards Air Force Base. Now, the flight characteristics of an F-4 without power is about like that of a rock. It's not very good. So we were in a precipitous decline and coming down. So I called Edwards Air Force Base and I said I wanted a straight-in approach to a final landing, not do the normal going over the numbers, do a quick 360 and land. And they came back and said, no, go around and come in from the east to land into the prevailing wind. And from the front cockpit, he was shaking his head vigorously and saying, no, I can't do that. And so I said, I want a straight-in approach. And they said, well, we're going to have to declare an emergency to do that and shut the airport down. And he vigorously shook his head yes and gave me the thumbs up, so I declared an emergency. We were coming in with no power, and at about a little over a quarter of a mile off the end of the runway, we lit off one engine at idle and did a dead stick landing, which is at about 200 knots rather than the normal 135. Rolled out the entire 2-mile length of the runway at idle, never using any power. Turned off the end of the runway, and in 200 feet, the engine flamed out. We had no fuel left. Had we had to use any power coming in, we would have never made it. So I don't know, he was a Naval Academy graduate, and so he had a lot of friends, and I am sure had to pull in some markers on that, but I don't know, I never got a letter in my file for declaring, because to declare an emergency, Edwards had to shut down the base. They didn't know for how long, so they had to divert any any air traffic in the area somewhere else, and it was not a good thing to do. But I never got a letter. But I also, because I didn't want to get him in trouble, I never told anybody about it when we got back, even my wife. And she didn't find out until about 2 weeks later when we had a squadron party. And his wife mentioned her. She said, how did John get by that flight on Wednesday? He said, Jesse never drinks except maybe a beer on the weekends. And he came home and had 2 martinis before he would even have dinner. So I got in a lot of trouble at home for not telling her about.
And this all kind of started because he didn't.
He didn't want to turn in his oxygen mask and get a new one. So, I have one other story about survival training.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through 3 different survival training exercises in the time that I was in. One was at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida when I was in primary flight training in Pensacola, where we went through and did a lot of things on gathering food and all, and then at the end went through a mock prison camp, but talked about some of the harsh treatment that we could get. The second one was in San Diego, where we started out at the SEALs training facility on Coronado and learned a lot about being down on and getting to a shore and finding places to fish and food, so forth. And then we spent the next 5 days in the desert. And then the final day and a half, we spent again in a prison camp, learning about things like we experienced things like waterboarding. We experienced being buried alive and having a straw to breathe through, and to see how you would think. The one thing that we were told about but never actually experienced was a very common torture technique that was used and is still used today, where they tie your hands behind your back and run a rope from those tied hands up over a rafter and hang you there until your arms come out of the sockets. That, as I say, we heard about but never experienced. The SEALs were very careful to quickly terminate something if they thought it was getting out of hand, because they were dealing with people that had several $1 million worth of training. I joined the Navy and served from 1962 through 1968. When I was on active duty, I flew planes off an aircraft carrier. On 2 occasions, I found myself deployed to the Tonkin Gulf and the South China Sea. I lost a lot of friends and colleagues who never came home, or who got shipped home in a pine box. I have one friend, Charlie Plum, that I mentioned earlier, who now lives in Ventura County, California, about 40 miles northwest of Los Angeles. Got a plane shot out from under him when he was over Hanoi, and spent the next close to 6 years of his life being tortured in North Vietnamese prison camps. So, and that was all to satisfy the capricious whims of egotistical bureaucrats like Robert McNamara or Dean Rusk, or politicians like Lyndon Johnson, who cared nothing about how many people died as long as he got reelected. So my advice to anybody thinking about military service is it can be a great career, or even a great beginning to a civilian career. It gives you a chance to mature and get a lot of responsibility and see whether you can handle it. but go into it with your eyes wide open, because wars are not started by generals with stars on their shoulders. Wars are started by politicians. And that's my advice